There was a time, about 5 years ago, when my mom used to complain about the doorbell ringing in the mornings. It would ring at night, between 2 and 3 a.m. It was persistent and demanding. My mom used to say that she was surprised that nobody else in the house heard it except her. She would get up, walk to the hallway, and ask, not rushing to open the door, "Who is there?" Every time, the only response she got was silence. We didn't have a peephole back then. We had it installed during renovations 2 years ago. So, she listened carefully, hoping to hear footsteps or a rustle behind the door. But in vain the bell rang again, and no one answered. And every time, my mother hesitated to open the door and went back to bed. In the morning, before going to work, she complained to me and my father that someone had come again at night, rang the doorbell persistently, and didn't respond. My father, being a skeptic and a humorist by nature, joked that it was her conscience or a ghost of a salary increase that came to visit. But my mother didn't feel like joking about it. Like my father, I didn't hear those strange calls, and I thought my mother was imagining them in her sleep. But they repeated every week with enviable regularity. Eventually, my mother stopped going to the door, and the night calls stopped. As it turned out, only temporarily. Since last year, I started suffering from insomnia. I could lie for hours in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and listening to the clock ticking right next to my ear. Time in such nights crawled by slowly, like molasses. Only when it started to get light outside did the long-awaited sleep come, usually deep and colorless. I never tried taking sleeping pills, but I would drink herbal tea, chamomile, mint, or lime before bed, although it didn't do much good. And night, the time for rest and sleep, turned into a time of painful wakefulness for me. It happened on one of those sleepless nights. It was the beginning of February, a moonless and quiet night, with snow falling outside. I was alone in the apartment. My parents had gone to visit my godmother, but couldn't come back because the buses were cancelled due to the bad weather. I went to bed late, around 1 o'clock. I usually go to bed earlier since classes start in the morning. But as soon as my head touched the pillow, I realized that I wouldn't be able to sleep again. I tossed and turned, wrapped myself in blankets and throws, covered my head with a pillow, trying to force myself to fall asleep. But all my attempts were in vain. I had to resort to the old tradition of lying on my back, motionless, thinking about everything in the world and waiting for the sky to start getting light, as sleep would come with the first rays of dawn. Suddenly, I shuddered with surprise. The doorbell rang. It was piercing. Someone pressed the button too hard, as if they wanted to wake up the neighbors as well. I thought my parents had returned and hurried to the front door, already reaching for the door lock, mechanically asking, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. I became wary. The bell rang again, just as insistently. "Who's there?" I asked. "Answer me." There was no response, just silence. I listened carefully, but there was no sound outside the door, just complete silence. Then I started to feel scared and shivers went down my spine. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again. I tiptoed and looked through the peephole. The landing was illuminated by the bright light of 2 bulbs. I saw a boy standing at the doorstep. He looked about 10 years old, wearing a simple coat, no hat, felt boots, and mittens hanging from the rubber bands on the sleeves. He had dark hair, a round face, but no expression, big, colorless eyes, and his clothes were dry, even though it was snowing outside. He lifted his head and looked up as if he knew I was watching him. Then I realized, how could such a small child reach the doorbell, and why wasn't he responding? And where did he come from? There were no children of that age in our building. These thoughts made me shiver to the bone. I continued to watch him, and suddenly, the boy's lips twisted and his face darkened. He opened his mouth and said, "Don't look at me." His voice was hoarse and creaky, like an old man's. "Don't look, or it will be worse." I scream in horror and step back into the corridor. But there's scratching and raspy murmurs at the door. Paralyzed with fear, I don't know what to do. And they keep scratching and rasping. "Dear God," I shout, "protect me from evil." And I start crossing myself on the door with trembling hands. "Help me, Lord. Keep me safe from harm." Almost immediately, the scratching stops. Something wheezes, hits the door, and falls silent. I keep making the sign of the cross with my hand. I stand like this for about 10 minutes. I listen carefully. Silence. I don't dare look through the peephole in the door. I go back to my room, turn on the light, and sit there until morning, exhausted and tense. My parents came back around noon. They woke me up, complaining about the bad weather and asking what had happened to the front door. We said there were scratches on it. It's covered in leather. We recently replaced the covering, and the scratches are small but noticeable and deep. I thought I would faint when I saw them, but I managed to hold myself together. Since then, we haven't heard any ringing at the door. My mother hasn't either. Thank God. Someone or something has clearly given up on getting us to open the door, or they're scared that they've been seen. Or they are knocking on someone else's door, and God forbid, they'll open it.